The gentle hum of the air conditioner filled Catherine Martinez's temporary apartment as she stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching Atlanta's skyline shimmer in the evening light. Her fingers traced the edges of the appointment letter she'd read at least a dozen times today. 20 years of service have led to this moment, yet she felt more like a student preparing for their first day of school than the incoming chief of police for one of America's largest departments. The letter's official seal caught the last rays of sunlight, throwing golden reflections across her living room walls. Catherine smiled, remembering her father's words when she first entered the FBI Academy. True leadership isn't about wearing the right uniform. It's about understanding the hearts beating underneath them. She moved away from the window, past unopened moving boxes labeled in her precise handwriting, and settled into her favorite armchair. Her laptop displayed dozens of tabs, departmental records, officer profiles, community statistics, but none of these told the real story. Numbers couldn't capture the pulse of a police force, and statistics couldn't measure the spirit of its officers. Her phone buzzed with another congratulatory message, this time from her former FBI supervisor in Washington. Everyone expected her to make a grand entrance, to assert her authority from day one. Catherine had different plans. She closed her laptop and pulled out a small notebook, already filled with observations and ideas. The television in the background played a local news segment about her appointment, but the photo they used was outdated, from her days running the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Seattle. Perfect. Few people would recognize her now, with her longer hair and casual attire. This anonymity would be her greatest asset in the week ahead. Catherine walked to her closet, pushing aside her newly pressed chief's uniform. Instead, she pulled out a collection of everyday outfits: jeans, simple blouses, comfortable shoes. For the next 7 days, she would become invisible, just another face in the crowd, observing her department in its natural state, understanding its rhythms and relationships before stepping into her role. She sat at her small dining table, spreading out a map of the city. Her fingers traced the patrol routes she'd memorized, lingering on the areas with the highest number of incident reports. The Blue Moon Cafe caught her eye, a popular spot for officers during their morning shifts. It would make an excellent starting point. As night fell over Atlanta, Catherine prepared for bed with the same methodical attention she'd given to FBI operations. Her alarm was set for 5 a.m., her clothes laid out, and her observer's notebook ready. She learned long ago that the best way to understand a system was to experience it from the ground up. In the bathroom mirror, she practiced relaxing her face into an expression of casual indifference, the look of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere in particular. The art of blending in had been part of her training, but never had it felt more crucial than now. She made one final check of her equipment for tomorrow: a concealed camera pen, her backup law enforcement ID tucked into a hidden pocket, and a small recorder disguised as a fitness tracker. Not standard gear for a police chief, but essential tools for someone about to undertake the most important undercover operation of their career. As she finally lay in bed, Catherine reflected on the weight of what she was about to do. Traditional leadership would have her walk in with badges blazing, asserting authority through rank and regulation. But real change required understanding, and understanding required observation. Tomorrow, she would begin to see her department through the eyes of those it served, both the officers and the public. The city lights painted patterns on her ceiling as she drifted off to sleep, her mind already mapping out the conversations and encounters that awaited her. In just a few hours, Catherine Martinez, the highly decorated FBI agent and newly appointed chief of police, would disappear. In her place would emerge just another face in the morning crowd, armed with nothing but attention and patience, and the power to reshape an entire department. The Blue Moon Cafe sparkled in the early morning light, its windows reflecting the orange glow of sunrise. Catherine arrived just as the first wave of patrol officers began filtering in, their badges catching the light as they moved through the glass doors. The aroma of freshly ground coffee beans wrapped around her like a warm embrace as she stepped inside. Officer Mike Sullivan's presence dominated the corner of the cafe like a storm cloud on a sunny day. His table, positioned perfectly between the counter and the window, had remained his unofficial territory for the past 8 years, according to the intel in Catherine's files. A paper cup marked with multiple caffeine shots sat before him, steam rising in delicate spirals that contrasted with his rigid posture. The cafe staff moved with practiced caution around his space. The young barista, her name tag reading Emma, automatically started preparing what Catherine assumed was his usual order when he merely lifted his empty cup. Other officers scattered throughout the cafe maintained a noticeable buffer around Sullivan's corner, their conversations dropping to whispers when they passed his table. Catherine ordered a simple black coffee, positioning herself at the counter where she could observe the morning dynamics unfold. She watched as a rookie officer nearly sat at the empty chair across from Sullivan, only to be yanked away by his training officer with a sharp whisper. The rookie's face flushed red as he realized his near mistake. Through the window, Catherine noticed Sullivan's patrol car parked in the fire lane, its white bulk blocking access to the building's emergency exits. The positioning violated at least 2 department regulations she could cite from memory. More concerning was how the other officers simply worked around it, their own vehicles carefully arranged to accommodate his preferred spot. The morning crowd thickened, and Catherine found herself being jostled by the growing line of customers. She stepped back, accidentally bumping Sullivan's table. His coffee sloshed dangerously close to the rim, and the temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. The conversation around them died as quickly as a candle in a windstorm. "Watch it," Sullivan growled without looking up from his phone, his thumb scrolling through what appeared to be sports scores. His free hand tightened around the coffee cup, knuckles whitening with pressure. Catherine could have moved on. Her instincts, honed by years of undercover work, screamed at her to maintain her cover. But the patrol car in the fire lane represented everything she'd come to Atlanta to change. The small abuses of power that grew into larger ones when left unchecked. "Excuse me, officer," she said, keeping her voice neutral but firm. "I couldn't help but notice your vehicle is blocking the fire lane." The cab fell silent. Emma, the barista, froze mid-pour, coffee overflowing the cup she was filling. 2 rookie officers near the door suddenly found their phones fascinating, though Catherine noticed one angling his device to record whatever was about to unfold. Sullivan finally looked up from his phone, his eyes, the pale blue of a winter morning, fixed on Catherine with the kind of dismissive glance reserved for something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "And you are," he drawled, each word dripping with manufactured patience. Catherine felt the weight of her concealed law enforcement ID pressing against her ribs. This moment balanced on a knife's edge. She could reveal her identity and end this immediately, or she could push further, see how deep this particular rabbit hole went. "Just a concerned citizen," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "The fire lane needs to stay clear for emergencies. I'm sure you understand." Sullivan's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, using every inch of his 6'2" frame to loom over her. The coffee cup in his hand trembled slightly, not from fear, Catherine noted, but from the effort of controlling his anger. Around them, the cafe held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The morning sun caught the badge on Sullivan's chest, throwing sharp reflections across the cafe walls. In that moment, Catherine saw not just one officer, but a symptom of a larger problem, the kind she'd come here to solve. She reached for her ID, knowing that what happened next would set the tone for her entire tenure as chief. Time crystallized in the Blue Moon Cafe as Catherine reached for her ID. Sullivan's shadow loomed over her, his coffee cup clutched like a weapon in his trembling hand. Behind the counter, Emma had already reached for the phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad, reading the room's tension with the instincts of someone who'd seen trouble brew before. "Listen carefully," Sullivan said, his voice pitched low enough that only Catherine and the nearest customers could hear. "I don't know who you think you are, but I've worked this beat for 15 years. That spot out there, it's mine. Just like this table is mine. Just like this entire morning is mine until my shift starts." Catherine's fingers brushed against her ID, but she paused. Years of training had taught her to read micro-expressions, and Sullivan's face was an open book of barely contained fury. The slight twitch beneath his left eye, the tension in his jaw, the way his free hand kept clenching and unclenching, all warning signs she documented countless times in FBI behavior analysis reports. 15 years is a long time to serve the public, Catherine said, choosing her words with precision. Long enough to know better than to block emergency access. She maintained eye contact, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his growing agitation. 3 other officers had shifted in their seats, uncertain whether to intervene. Sullivan barked out a laugh that held no humor. Serve the public. Lady, you have no idea what serving the public means. While you're sitting in your comfortable office somewhere, I'm out there dealing with the real world. His coffee cup tilted dangerously as he gestured toward the window. The morning sun streaming through the cafe's windows cast strange shadows across Sullivan's face, deepening the lines of anger etched around his mouth. A young mother pulled her child closer as she hurried past their confrontation toward the door. The quiet clicking of phone cameras provided a subtle soundtrack to the unfolding scene. Catherine slowly withdrew her ID, holding it at waist level. Actually, Officer Sullivan, I understand more than you might think. She kept her voice steady, professional, the same tone she used during countless FBI negotiations. I'm showing you my identification now, and I'm asking you once again to move your vehicle. Sullivan's eyes dropped to her ID. In that fraction of a second, Catherine saw something change in his expression. A dangerous cocktail of shock, embarrassment, and rage. His face flushed dark red, spreading down his neck and disappearing into his collar. The coffee in his cup sloshed violently against the plastic lid. You think a fancy badge gives you the right to come into my space and tell me what to do? His voice rose with each word, bouncing off the cafe's windows. The other officers were definitely standing now, finally sensing that this had escalated beyond a simple morning dispute. Catherine remained perfectly still, her ID still visible between them. This isn't about rights, Officer Sullivan. This is about responsibility. Now, please step back and... The coffee cup exploded forward like a missile. Catherine registered several things in rapid succession. The burning sensation as hot liquid hit her face, the collective gasp from the cafe's patrons, and the distinctive sound of multiple phones capturing what would soon become viral footage. She didn't flinch, didn't cry out, though her skin screamed in protest. Through the steam rising from her soaked blouse, Catherine watched the realization of what he'd done dawn on Sullivan's face. His empty hand hung in the air where the cup had been, fingers spread in a gesture that looked almost like surrender. The cafe had gone completely silent, the kind of heavy quiet that precedes a thunderstorm. And then the door chimed. Sergeant Roberts, Sullivan's direct supervisor, stood frozen in the doorway, his phone already pressed to his ear. Yes, we need medical assistance at Blue Moon Cafe, he was saying, his eyes locked on the scene before him. And send internal affairs. Officer Sullivan just assaulted. He paused, his face draining of color as recognition hit. He just assaulted our new chief of police. The burning sensation spread across Catherine's face like wildfire, but her eyes never left Sullivan's. Drops of coffee traced paths down her neck, staining her pale blue blouse a darker shade. The cafe's air conditioning hit the wet fabric, sending an involuntary shiver through her body. Yet she remained standing, perfectly still, as if rooted to the floor by some invisible force. Sullivan's face performed an elaborate dance of emotions, anger dissolving into confusion, confusion morphing into dawning horror. His empty hand still hung in the air, coffee cup now lying forgotten at his feet, creating a brown puddle that spread across the polished floor like a prosecutor's evidence marker. Chief Martinez? Sergeant Roberts' voice cracked as he rushed forward, shrugging off his jacket to offer it to Catherine. 2 other officers immediately flanked Sullivan, their hands hovering near their handcuffs, waiting for instructions that nobody seemed ready to give. The young barista, Emma, appeared with a stack of clean towels and a first aid kit, her hands trembling but determined. Nobody moves, Catherine said, her voice carrying the same authority that had commanded FBI tactical teams. Despite the pain searing across her skin, she maintained perfect composure. Sergeant Roberts, secure the scene. Officer Sullivan will remain exactly where he is. Through the cafe's windows, she could see a small crowd gathering. Phones pointed inward like accusing fingers, recording every moment. A news van screeched to a halt outside. Someone had already tipped off the media. Catherine could feel her carefully planned week of anonymous observation crumbling around her, but perhaps this moment would serve an even greater purpose. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their efficient movements cutting through the tension. As they examined her burns, Catherine watched Sullivan sink into a chair, the fight draining from his body as internal affairs officers entered the cafe. His badge, the symbol of authority he'd wielded so carelessly moments ago, caught the morning light one final time before an IA officer carefully removed it. First-degree burns, possibly some second-degree patches, the paramedic announced, applying a cooling gel to Catherine's face. You'll need proper medical attention, Chief. The title sparked another visible flinch from Sullivan, who now sat with his head in his hands, looking less like the intimidating figure of minutes ago and more like a deflating balloon. Catherine accepted a fresh towel from Emma, gently patting her neck dry. Document everything, she instructed Roberts, who was already coordinating with Aya. I want statements from everyone present, and someone secure the security footage. Her tactical mind was already processing the incident, transforming personal assault into professional opportunity. Through the cafe's windows, she could see Sullivan's patrol car still parked in the fire lane, the catalyst that had sparked this entire confrontation. A tow truck was already approaching, its yellow lights casting intermittent flashes across the growing crowd of spectators. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Chief, Roberts began, his face ashen with concern and embarrassment. I want you to know that Officer Sullivan's behavior. This isn't representative of. Catherine raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. What it represents, Sergeant, is exactly what I came here to understand. She winced slightly as the paramedic applied more cooling gel. Sometimes the best way to identify a problem is to experience it firsthand. The cafe had transformed into a whirlwind of activity. IA officers taking statements, paramedics completing their assessment, journalists outside pressing their cameras against the windows. Yet in the eye of this storm, Catherine stood steady, already seeing beyond this moment to the changes it would catalyze. Sullivan's empty coffee cup still lay on the floor, a small pool of liquid spreading outward like ripples in a pond. One poorly controlled moment of rage had just triggered waves of change that would transform the entire department. As Catherine finally allowed herself to be led toward the waiting ambulance, she knew that her real work was just beginning. The hospital room's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow across Catherine's bandaged face as she sat propped up against starched pillows, her phone pressed to her ear. Outside her door, 2 officers stood guard, not because she needed protection, but because the media circus in the parking lot had grown into a full 3-ring spectacle. Postpone the ceremony, she instructed her assistant, her voice steady despite the medication-dulled pain. But don't cancel it. This changes the timeline, not the mission. She ended the call and immediately dialed internal affairs, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The events at Blue Moon Cafe had been playing on every local news channel for the past 3 hours, each replay revealing new details she cataloged with professional detachment. Detective Sarah Reynolds from Internal Affairs answered on the first ring. Chief Martinez, we've already pulled Sullivan's complete record. Catherine could hear papers shuffling in the background. There's something you need to see. Let me guess, Catherine replied, reaching for the laptop her assistant had dropped off. A pattern of similar incidents, but nothing that stuck. She logged into the department's database, her security clearance now giving her access to files that had been restricted just days ago. 17 complaints in 15 years, Reynolds confirmed, most filed by minority civilians. All dismissed due to lack of evidence or witnesses mysteriously changing their statements. More paper shuffling. But here's where it gets interesting. 3 of those complaints were filed by fellow officers. They all transferred out within months. Catherine's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up personnel files. A picture emerged with each click, not just of Sullivan, but of an entire system designed to protect its own at the expense of justice. Her FBI training helped her see the patterns within patterns, the subtle connections that painted a larger portrait of departmental dysfunction. A soft knock interrupted her analysis. Emma, the barista from Blue Moon, stood nervously in the doorway, still wearing her coffee-stained apron. "I'm sorry to intrude, Chief Martinez, but..." She twisted her hands together. "There's something you should know about Officer Sullivan. About what happens at the cafe." For the next 20 minutes, Emma detailed years of similar incidents, smaller aggressions, subtle threats, the careful maintenance of Sullivan's territory through intimidation. Other officers saw it, she concluded, her voice stronger now. Some even apologized to us afterward. But nobody ever did anything. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from her FBI contact, footage going national, CN picking it up. "Call me." She set the phone aside, focusing instead on Emma's trembling hands, seeing in them the fear that had allowed Sullivan's behavior to continue unchecked for so long. "Thank you, Emma," Catherine said softly. "Would you be willing to make an official statement?" When Emma nodded, Catherine pressed the intercom for her security detail. "Please escort Ms. Emma to Detective Reynolds. Full protective protocol." As the door closed behind Emma, Catherine turned back to her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as faces of transferred officers filled her screen, good cops who tried to speak up, only to be silenced by the system's machinery. She began typing, crafting a department-wide email that would shake the foundations of that very machinery. The pain medication was wearing off, her burns beginning to throb in time with her heartbeat, but Catherine kept typing. Sullivan's coffee attack had stripped away her planned week of anonymous observation, but it had also exposed exactly what she needed to see. Sometimes the fastest way to understand the system's flaws was to experience them personally. A text from Sergeant Roberts lit up her phone. "Officers requesting permission to visit. Show of support." Catherine smiled, though it pulled at her bandages. The ripples were already becoming waves, and she intended to ride them all the way to shore. "Permission granted," she texted back. "But remind them, this isn't about me. This is about who we choose to be as a department." The precinct buzzed with nervous energy as Catherine walked through its doors for the first time as chief, her burns still visible but healing. Officers parted before her like waves, some nodding in respect, others averting their eyes. The security footage from Blue Moon Cafe played silently on every news channel, visible on the break room television through open doorways. Detective James Morgan, a 20-year veteran, was clearing out his desk when Catherine passed. His resignation letter lay on top of a cardboard box filled with personal items. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. 3 other desks already stood empty, officers who'd quit rather than face the coming changes. "Chief Martinez," called a voice from behind her. Officer Lisa Chen jogged to catch up, holding a thick folder. "I have something you need to see." She glanced around nervously before continuing. "It's about the Sullivan incident. And others like it." Catherine led Officer Chen into her office, noting how the younger woman's hands trembled slightly as she placed the folder on the desk. Inside were dozens of informal complaints, incidents never officially reported but carefully documented by officers who'd felt powerless to act. Dates, times, witnesses, all meticulously recorded but never brought to light. "We wanted to say something," Chen explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Sullivan had friends in high places. Anyone who spoke up found themselves working the worst shifts, getting passed over for promotions, or worse." The office door opened again as Sergeant Roberts entered with his own stack of papers. "More officers coming forward, Chief. Not just about Sullivan. They're ready to talk about everything." His eyes held a mix of shame and determination. "We should have done this years ago." Catherine stood at her window, watching the yard where officers gathered in small clusters during their breaks. The divisions were visible even from here, Some groups animated and engaged, others closed off and defensive. Change was coming, and everyone knew it. Schedule a department-wide meeting, she instructed Roberts. Mandatory attendance, and get me everything on those empty desks, case files, reports, unofficial notes. Everything. The meeting room filled slowly that afternoon. Catherine observed from the podium as officers chose their seats, noting the invisible lines being drawn. Veterans who'd worked alongside Sullivan clustered near the back, their expressions guarded. Younger officers and those who'd come forward with complaints sat up front, their posture eager but anxious. "I didn't come to Atlanta to start a war," Catherine began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I came to build a department worthy of the badge we wear. What happened at Blue Moon Cafe didn't create our problems. It simply exposed them." She clicked through slides showing statistics, complaints, and patterns that stretched back years. With each revelation, more officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But others sat straighter, finally seeing their private concerns validated. "Some of you have already chosen to leave," she continued, gesturing to the empty chairs. "Others are wondering if you should. I'm here to tell you that what matters isn't what you've done before. It's what you choose to do now." Officer Chen raised her hand, her voice stronger now. "What about the officers who enabled Sullivan, who covered for him?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Catherine set aside her prepared notes. "Accountability isn't about revenge. It's about growth. Every officer in this room has a choice to make. You can be part of the problem we're leaving behind, or part of the solution we're building together." As if on cue, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Sullivan had just been formally charged. The message rippled through the room as officers checked their own phones, the reality of change settling over them like a heavy blanket. "The line is drawn," Catherine concluded, her gaze sweeping the room. "Where do you stand is up to you. But know this, tomorrow's department will be built by those who choose to stay and make it better, not those who quit to keep it the same." Rain drummed against the hearing room's high windows, casting shifting shadows across Sullivan's face as he sat before the review board. His perfectly pressed uniform and polished badge seemed at odds with his haunted expression. 3 weeks had passed since the Blue Moon Cafe incident, and the viral video had accumulated millions of views. Catherine sat opposite him, her burn marks faded but still visible under the fluorescent lights. The room was packed. Journalists lined the back wall, while officers filled every available seat. Emma from the cafe sat in the front row, her barista apron replaced by a professional blazer, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "Officer Michael Sullivan," began Commissioner Richardson, his voice echoing in the tense chamber. "You stand accused of assault against a superior officer, conduct unbecoming, and multiple violations of departmental policy. How do you plead?" Sullivan's attorney leaned forward to whisper in his ear, but Sullivan shook his head slightly. "Guilty," he said, his voice barely carrying across the room. A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. Catherine watched him carefully, noting how his shoulders had lost their characteristic swagger. The man who had commanded his corner of the cafe through fear now looked diminished, as if the weight of his actions had physically compressed him. "Chief Martinez," Commissioner Richardson turned to her. "As the injured party, you have the right to make a statement." Catherine stood, smoothing her chief's uniform. She hadn't prepared a speech, didn't need to. Every word she was about to say had been building inside her since that morning at Blue Moon. "This hearing isn't about a cup of coffee," she began, her voice steady. "It's not even about assault on a superior officer. This is about power, how we wield it, how we share it, and how we hold each other accountable for its use." She moved to the center of the room, commanding attention without effort. In the 3 weeks since the incident, 17 officers have come forward with similar stories. 3 local businesses have filed formal complaints about Officer Sullivan's behavior. 8 transferred officers have requested to have their cases reviewed. Sullivan seemed to shrink further into his chair as Catherine continued. But perhaps most telling are the dozens of citizens who have reached out, people who witnessed incidents but felt powerless to report them, people who accepted intimidation as the price of having law enforcement in their neighborhood. Opening a folder, Catherine extracted a single sheet of paper. This is Officer Sullivan's first performance review from 15 years ago. His supervisor wrote, "Shows promising leadership qualities. Commands respect from peers and public alike." The tragedy isn't just what Officer Sullivan became, it's what he could have been if someone had shown him a better way to lead. Rain continued to paint patterns on the windows as Catherine turned to face Sullivan directly. "I'm not here to demand the harshest punishment. I'm here to ensure that this moment becomes a turning point, not just for Officer Sullivan, but for every person who wears this badge." She placed a stack of files on the commissioner's desk. "These are the reform proposals I've drafted based on what we've learned from this incident. New training protocols, enhanced oversight measures, community engagement requirements. Because while Officer Sullivan must face consequences for his actions, we must face our responsibility to prevent the next Sullivan from being created." The room had fallen completely silent. Even the journalist had stopped typing, caught up in the gravity of the moment. Emma wiped tears from her eyes as Catherine concluded her statement. The hand that threw that coffee cup didn't become corrupt overnight. It was shaped by years of unchallenged behavior, silent witnesses, and a system that prioritized authority over accountability. Today, we begin dismantling that system. Sullivan finally looked up, meeting Catherine's gaze for the first time since the hearing began. In his eyes, she saw something unexpected, not defiance or anger, but recognition. Sometimes, she realized, the hardest lessons came wrapped in the most painful packages. 1 year later, the Blue Mood Cafe sparkled in the morning sun, its windows newly renovated and its atmosphere transformed. Catherine sat at what had once been Sullivan's corner table, now just another spot in a bustling coffee shop where officers and civilians mingled freely. Emma, now the cafe's manager, placed a fresh cup of coffee before her with a warm smile. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Emma said, sliding into the seat across from Catherine. The burns on Catherine's face had faded to almost nothing, visible only to those who knew where to look. "We had a reporter in here yesterday, wanting to do an anniversary story about the coffee cup that changed Atlanta." Catherine smiled, watching her officers interact with the morning customers. Officer Chen, recently promoted to sergeant, was explaining community outreach programs to an elderly couple. Two rookie officers, part of the most diverse recruiting class in the department's history, were helping a lost tourist with directions. "How's the new training program working out?" Emma asked, nodding toward a fresh-faced officer wearing a field training observer badge. The program had been Catherine's idea, civilian volunteers who provided feedback on officer interactions during their probationary period. "Complaints are down 60%, Catherine replied, sipping her coffee, "and officer satisfaction scores are up. Turns out, most people who choose this profession actually want to serve their communities. They just need the right tools and support." Her phone buzzed with a text from Officer Roberts, now Captain Roberts, heading the department's new Professional Standards Division. The message contained a link to their latest transparency report, all civilian complaints, use of force incidents, and their resolutions, published monthly on the department's website. The cafe's door chimed, and Catherine looked up to see a familiar face. Mike Sullivan, no longer in uniform, stood awkwardly in the doorway. He'd served 6 months of probation and undergone mandatory counseling before being allowed to retire. Now he taught de-escalation techniques at the police academy, turning his experience into lessons for others. Sullivan caught Catherine's eye and gave a slight nod before ordering his coffee, not demanding it, not expecting special treatment, just another customer starting his day. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was progress. Sometimes transformation came in small gestures as much as sweeping changes. Catherine opened her laptop, reviewing the morning's reports. The changes hadn't all been smooth. 4 more officers had resigned in protest over the new accountability measures, and some veteran sergeants still grumbled about the old days. But the numbers told a different story: improved response times, increased community trust scores, and a steady stream of quality recruits drawn by the department's new reputation. "Chief?" A young officer approached her table, tablet in hand. "We just got the results from the Community Satisfaction Survey. They want to know if you're available for a press conference." Catherine glanced at the data and smiled. The improvements were significant, but what really caught her eye was the demographic breakdown. The positive ratings came from all neighborhoods, all backgrounds, exactly the kind of equal service she'd envisioned. Standing to leave, she left her empty cup on the table, just an ordinary coffee cup now, no longer a symbol of power or privilege. Outside, her patrol officers were visible on every corner, not imposing authority but embodying service. Some walked with community members, others chatted with shop owners, all wearing body cameras that live streamed to the department's public accountability portal. "Same time tomorrow, Chief," Emma called as Catherine reached the door. Catherine paused, looking back at the bustling cafe. A year ago, she'd walked in here planning to observe her department undercover. Instead, she'd become the catalyst for its transformation. "Wouldn't miss it," she replied. "After all, this is where change begins, one cup of coffee at a time." The morning sun caught her badge as she stepped outside, throwing brilliant reflections across the sidewalk. But now those reflections didn't signal authority. They illuminated a path forward, showing what was possible when power transformed into service and fear gave way to trust.